Nice. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Every Week English with Josh Golson. Today, we will be talking all things family. So, of course, last time we talked about food, some of my experiences with food. Here, you'll get to know a little bit about me and my family as well. Of course, some great vocab words to go along with them, some adjectives about the personalities, some idioms as well, as always. Otherwise, make sure you drop a like, you share it around to your other friends who are trying to learn English, or just if they're interested. So to start off, we got our three idioms. Right? That is easier said than done, right? So it just means it's difficult, right? If somebody says like, "Hey, I'm gonna run a mile," and you say, "Oh," you look at him and he's not in shape, right? He's not fit. You say, "Oh, that's easier said than done," right? So you can say it easy peasy, but you can't actually do it. The second one being break a leg, right? So по-русски, you can think of it like ни пуха, ни пера, right? Of course, the answer to that is к черту, which means go to hell. You sort of say the same thing to actors. Instead of saying good luck, right, to actors, you say break a leg. Just means good luck. And the last one will be up a creek without a paddle. Of course, this means you are in a very bad situation. Probably you can't get out of it. You can also shorten it down to just up a creek, right? It looks like we're up a creek, right? Terrible situation, can't get out of it. Now, with some of those personality vocabulary words, got some good ones. Affectionate, that means loving. Ambitious, right? Somebody who is always trying to get ahead. Anxious, somebody who is stressed. Bossy, someone who tells you what to do, no matter what their authority level is at. Right? So a little kid can be bossy, right? They just tell people what to do. Of course, charming means to be very friendly. Competitive means to try and be the best, right, out of the competition. Honest, I think everybody understands that. Imaginative, you have good imagination. Independent, you do not rely on anybody. You are self-sufficient. Insecure, you think poorly about yourself. The opposite is confident, right? Mature, it means you act older than you actually are. So like teenagers can be mature sometimes, even kids can be mature, whereas adults could be immature, which is the opposite. Of course, moody means it's like bipolar, right? Very happy one second, very sad the next. Patient, you wait a lot. They say patience is a virtue, right? Virtue means a good thing. The opposite of that is vice, right? Vice is a bad thing. Rebellious, right? You fight against power, you fight against authority, whether or not it's real or legitimate authority. And there's reliable, so that means you can trust their word. Self-confident, same confident, right? Selfish, you can think of it like greedy, right? They do everything for themselves. Sensible, think of common sense, right? Very down to earth based. They think in a very common way. Versus sensitive is negative. So sensitive, you get offended very easily, right? If you are sensitive. Of course, sociable means you're very good with friends. Great word, higher diction I like to use is gregarious. And then a spoilt, right? По-русски испортиться. So you can use that for food, right? If you leave out your chicken for 2 days out of the fridge, it becomes spoiled. And you can also spoil children by giving them whatever they want. And stubborn, well, I'm quite stubborn. That's somebody who has already made up their mind and they will continue doing it no matter right? So a lot of good words there as well. Now, to talk a bit about my family, you all know me, right? Josh Golson. So, and I interviewed my parents as well. Um, of course, you can think, right, they were both bureaucrats. That has a negative connotation, or civil servants, right? Civil servants is positive, and they trained to do that. They both got public administration degrees at George Mason University. That's where my brother went. My aunt went there also, right? And I too went there. Um, so of course, with family vocabulary, you can think you've got you, your brother or your sister. They are called siblings. Right? You've got your parents, and if your parents have any siblings, if it is a brother, right, that's your uncle. If it is a sister, that is your aunt. Of course, your grandparents, your grandmother, grandfather, grandma, grandpa, same thing. And going up in ancestry, you call it your great, right? So you got great, 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 grandparents, for instance. And of course, going down, you say grandson, granddaughter. Now, if your uncle or your aunt has a child, right, that is your cousin. If your sibling, so your brother or sister has a child, if it's a daughter, that is your niece. If it's a son, that is your nephew, right? So these are all blood relatives, right? They're related to you by blood. Let's take, for example, your father gets divorced and marries someone else and has a child with that other person, with the other woman, his new wife, right? That is a half sibling, half sister, or half brother because they share the same blood as. Now, and then your dad becomes the step dad to that sibling, right? So, and then let's say your mom gets remarried to another guy, and he's your stepdad, or you could get a new stepmother. You can also have a stepson as well, and they are not related to you directly by blood, right? It's a son or a daughter from a previous marriage that is step. Likewise, if you marry into a family, everybody becomes in law. So there is no tiest ili tiosha or ziat or siokar, that sort of thing. It is just they're your mother, father-in-law, your son, daughter-in-law, your brother, your sister-in-law. And you talk about your in-laws, right? Going back to me a little bit, right? I do have one brother. He's about 4 years older than me. Very smart guy, I think, the last I heard of him. Haven't talked to him in 5 years, of course. So you can even argue, like, and I stated this as well, is like, he's no longer a brother to me, right? He's a brother in Christ, I think, mostly. Sure, still related by blood, but that's about it. Very smart guy, I think. All right, well, we're both smart kids because my parents are quite smart. We're both a little, autistic, I think. Just because in our daily lives, I think we're very eccentric and a little bit strange. So I don't know what he's up to. He studied IT at George Mason. He was very interested in photography. We used to play video games and airsoft together. Right, airsoft is punktball. So it's not paintball, Peruski punktball, I think. Using little plastic pellets or little BBs, they're called. Oh, nice. As you guys already heard, my parents, both government workers, right? Mom worked for the Pentagon. Dad worked for the Patent and Trademark Office. They worked very hard all their lives, I think. And like I said, they studied to do that. They studied public administration at university. Um, Whereas I studied Russian and Eurasian uh, studies with minor in criminology. Um, because, where I'm from, Northern Virginia, you basically have three fates or three destinies. Destiny is positive, fate is negative, but it means the same thing. Basically, you become a government worker, you become a retail worker, so like working at restaurants, working, selling clothes, that sort of things, or you escape, you run away, right? And I took the third option, right? I got out of it. And looking around at my friend group, and they they all became retail workers or they escaped, right? Um, Now, going up into my ancestry, so that's above you, that's your grandparents, great grandparents, your descendants are the opposite. That is your children, your great grandchildren, and so on. Um, and we always say father's side or mother's side to determine who you're talking about. So, for example, my grandfather on my father's side, right, Grandpa Golson, he was a World War II veteran. He fought from Normandy, right, from D-Day, all the way to the Battle of the Bulge. And he was the only one in his company who knew how to type. So he became the company typist. And still in Virginia, we have lots of records from that time. It's pretty cool. How many bullets were shot, how many tanks were taken, how many prisoners taken, how many people killed, all of those statistics. Quite interesting. Likewise, he took pictures of his time abroad. Um, One that always stands out is a picture of three Nazi collaborators hanging from nooses. And of course, in the States, that hasn't happened since, the late 1800s, around there. Um, like justice hangings. Um, sort of wild. So for Americans at least, World War II was a great turning point. Um, it basically set up America as the global hegemon, по-русски это гегемон, right? The world power. Uh, and so America wasn't invaded really. We had Pearl Harbor, but that's about it. Of course, we lost soldiers as well, but not such a big devastation like in Europe, not least like in Russia or the Baltic states, or Poland, right? Where they got divided and everything is very mixed. It's quite interesting when I talk to my students because um, often they're very, often they'll talk about World War II and what their grandparents or great grandparents were doing. And it's very mixed. So either they fought for the Nazis, right? And then they fought for the Soviets. Um, or you can believe that they fought for the independent republics like Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia. Um, but in this time, like I said, it was all mixed up because it was just a marching ground for soldiers. One very interesting story I heard was one of my students, their grandmother was born because of a German soldier. And he ran away to Canada, right? He was a Nazi. He ran away to Canada after getting her pregnant. And that lady then remarried, and sometime in her like 20s, after the fact, the Soviets, they came knocking. KGB called her in and said, "How do this guy? He keeps writing letters, right?" So the Nazi was writing letters to her, or I should say, former Nazi, new Canadian, right? Uh, he was writing letters to her, and they were wondering, who is this guy, right? And so she said she denied all knowledge of him, and that was that. Right? She never met him again for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, I've had other students where their lost grandparents, their lost grandfathers have come back from Canada, also the same story, but it's like they came back to Latvia or Estonia or Lithuania, and they had a family reunion basically, and they actually got married afterwards. Um, it is quite interesting. Lots of students also with people who got sent into the gulags. Um, a big thing at that time, right? If your loyalty was questioned at all to the party or the state, they gulagged you. Um, Even my wife's great uncle, this is according to what I heard from her father, um, got through. So he fought in World War II, got thrown into the. He was Russian, fought World War II, got thrown into the Gulag afterwards. Um, Likewise, her great grandfather, during the 20s, he was a kulak. So a kulak is like an entrepreneur, or they were a class of entrepreneurs, and they got blamed for all of the bad stuff in Russia in the early days of communism. And so he had a horse and he sold beer, and that was enough to make him wealthy in his village. I'm not talking like American standard wealthy. I'm talking like he had one extra chicken a week, right? So they shot him. That's it. He got what's called dekulakt, right? And this is a pretty common story I hear a lot, especially out here in Russia. It's quite sad. Um, what's interesting too is that her family were serfs, basically slaves, all throughout the 1800s and probably before then. And I have visited the manor house, the mansion where the landowner used to live and where her family worked as slaves, right, as serfs. And once communism came about, the communists stole that property from him for like a local baron, let's say, baron, and cut up his house into communalki, which is like a dormitory or an общежитие. And even her mother lived in that house where her family had once worked as serfs, as slaves. And it got turned into a museum, even. And I got the lovely chance to visit it. And Yulia's mother, she pointed where she lived. They didn't even have their own rooms, but they had to share rooms and they had to share kitchens and everything. It's communism. It is quite fascinating. Um, but of course, Yulia and her family are all from one province. Her parents lived about a mile away from each other for about 20 years. And then all of a sudden they ran into each other and they fell in love and got married. Yeah, it's funny. Of course, her father was a long haul trucker, right, as well as a mechanic on combines on farms. And her mother was an economist and a senior or head accountant for the farm. I always laugh and I always joke with her, well, how can you be an accountant or an economist under communism? Because there should be no money, right? That's one of the things about communism. Of course, they used money, and so they needed accountants. It was all a bunch of hypocrisy. Um, uh, then my grandmother so I talk about these people because I know them. I met my grandfather on my father's side. I also met my grandmother on my mother's side. Nice lady. She basically raised me. I spent a lot of time with her in my childhood. And she was once a professional ping pong player, and like she made headlines. So she was a little bit famous when it came to ping pong. What's quite interesting is that in Virginia, we've got photos from her family that go back to the 1880s, right? And it's photographs. It's really, really cool. And likewise, we've got all these photo albums of all of the different families. So like Grandpa Golson, his father was a farmer and he fought in World War I, right? He was a machine gunist, if I remember. Um, he was from Missouri. He married into a family from South Carolina, whereas my mother's family, they were from like Florida and Washington, D.C. Um, and at one point, they were quite wealthy. They owned blocks. So blocks are from street to street. They owned different blocks of apartment houses in DC. And I have been told that they owned a place called, they own some national park, which has horses. Um, I might be remembering it incorrectly as Chinkatink. Um, Probably a different place, though. Not sure. But of course, sold it to the government. And, as you do, if you're that wealthy, that rich, it disappears within 2 or 3 generations. And so, people start drinking, start gambling, and poof, it's all gone. This was a problem amongst Russians, and you can look up the authors, Dostoevsky, big gambler, Lermontov, a gambler also. Lots of people who just gambled away all their money. It is quite interesting. Of course, my wife, Yulia, she is an accountant, senior accountant, very, very smart lady with numbers. I am terrible with numbers. I am the humanities guy. So that's why I write books and that's why I teach English. Of course, I have a nickname. It was the haggler because I used to go to stores and I tried to negotiate or haggle prices. I'm talking like Starbucks or McDonald's, that sort of things. Also, because I went skiing once, I was called the Swede by my uncle and his family. Um, it's sort of funny. My uncle is a very funny guy. He served um, in the U.S. Air Force during the Cold War, and he served in Turkey. And during his breaks, he would take a Turkish to English dictionary and he would talk to the Turkish guards. Right, and he would make small talk with them. And so he sort of became friends. Now, there is a coup that happened, also called a coup de grace, which is when the government changes through violence or military force. And so this was an Islamist coup in the 1970s, and they kidnapped him, right? You can look him up, James Golson. Him and his friends they kidnapped. I think it was 4 or 5 American airmen, right? And the president came to my grandparents' house, right? And news cameras came and newspapers came as well to talk about this. And when the other Turks, right, the Turks from the friendly ones, found out that James Golson was taken, their friend, they called up those Islamists and they said, if you touch one hair on James's head, we will chop off all of your heads. And he claims that the very next day they were all released, right? So it's sort of crazy. And then back in 2015, 2016, I was traveling to the Czech Republic with my parents, and we ran into an old guy, like in his 70s, who claimed to have known my uncle, and he was serving in Air Force intelligence in Greece at that time. And he verified basically all of this stuff to us. One of those really crazy coincidences. Also, very, very, very interesting. He went on to work at the post office, right? One of his sons works at the post office. The other son works in IT, that sort of thing. And they all live on the West Coast in California. So I don't really talk to them very much. I don't really talk to most of my family besides my parents very much. And I think it's quite common amongst Americans. Whereas amongst Europeans, Eastern Europeans, family is all that matters. And it's very clan based, so very family based. My aunt, on the other hand, she worked for the National Archives. She was a professional historian. And if I remember, she has held the actual diary of Hitler, right? She has seen the actual skin lamps from the Holocaust. Um, she researched into carrier pigeons as well during World War One, and all of these other interesting things because she worked in Washington, D.C. at the National Archives there. Um, yeah, interesting lady. All she cares for now, though, pretty much is her cats. Um, and of course, she's got two kids, a daughter and a son. Son lives out in Nevada. I think he's a nurse. And don't really remember what the daughter does. Um, yeah, but that's a lot of the family. Of course, the Golsons came up from the South after World War II. Um, and my grandfather Golson was an IRS, like tax worker, basically. Um, and then my grandmother on my mother's side, Grandma Young, she was a secretary at the Pentagon, and she convinced the people there to pay for clown school for her, right? So the government and U.S. tax dollars went to paying for clown school for my grandmother. One of those very funny things. Um, and of course, like I was saying, very, very smart people, very affectionate. My mother is, you could describe her as like evangelical Christian. Um, everybody is Christian in this family, even my brother. He sort of fell into like cults of Christianity, so not sects, right? I know sekt по-русски это cult, по-английски, right? But sect is like Catholic or Protestant or Lutheran. Yeah. Of course, I'm Orthodox, the only true one out there, right? It goes all the way back to Christ. Um, but the average American household has, I believe it's 7 Bibles. Right? So I grew up with all that good stuff, with the Bible, with Christianity. Um, Now, whenever we talk about like world events, I think the biggest thing for Americans that was 9/11. Of course, my mom was in the Pentagon during 9/11. Luckily, she was on the other side, and so she was able to get out. And I was at preschool, so I sort of remember it. Um, Typically, in an American family, also, everything is egalitarian. Everything is split 50-50. And that's how it was between my parents, as far as I could see. So, like, dad was the leader of the family, but he always went to ma for advice, right? Or, as I like to say, pappy and man, right? Good ones. Um, Now, of course, Christmas always the biggest thing. And if you guys want to know what like classic American Christmas was like at my house, that was from the Christmas Story. So you get a Christmas tree and all the presents are there wrapped underneath it. Um, and it is quite wonderful when you wake up on Christmas. In Virginia, it's very rare to snow at that time, but when it does, it's fantastic. Um, Likewise, there is a coat of arms for the Golsons. So it's tree and a rock, and that is back in my room. There's a picture of it in my room in Virginia. Um, Also, there's a lot of very special family heirlooms that are passed down. So, for example, I lost my original wedding ring, and so my dad gave me his wedding ring. And so that's what I am wearing currently. And likewise, I have a lot of watches from my dad. And it's funny, when I was a kid, I would hide all the rings of my parents. And when we grew up, we looked through all these places and we found them, right? They were in these old Coke and old Pepsi machines. Um, I think we do have a classical traditional family Bible, but I think it's still down in South Carolina. Likewise, from World War II, besides just pictures, my grandfather brought back a Luger, right, which he then sold to the U.S. government. It's a shame, I think. We've also got Nazi binoculars, right? So glass binoculars to see far away, and a big dagger or knife, right? Um, Likewise, I have a sister-in-law, so my wife has a sister who lives over in Germany, in Berlin, and she is also a senior accountant. So I married into a family of right economists and accountants, and it is quite funny that I'm very similar to my father-in-law in that he likes history and politics, and so we can talk those things together. He's a very funny guy. Also a little bit eccentric. Also forgets a lot. Very much like myself. So with them, I get along very well. Normally, you make jokes about the mother-in-law and how you don't get along, but I call them my parents, right? And they call me their son, and that tells you how much we get along. Um, and I lived, I really like living with them also. Um, it because they're just great hosts, and the mother-in-law will stuff you. I know in America it's sort of stereotyped that Jewish mothers say eat, eat, eat some more, but it's also with Russian mothers also. Um, yeah, it is quite interesting. I would very much like to have children, but we're gonna hold off for that now. Yeah, otherwise, I taught kids for a bit, for about a year, year and a half. Um, and I've studied like how to raise kids and how to teach them as well. Um, Otherwise, yeah, if I hope to see some comments about your families out there. It would be interesting. I think every one of us has interesting family history. You, of course, can make a family tree, right, which goes to your descendants. Sorry, descendants and ancestors, right? So your grandparents, your parents, your uncles, your aunts, your cousins, and so on. Um, Likewise, don't forget about those idioms, right? Easier said than done, break a leg, and up a creek without a paddle. Make sure you follow, you subscribe, you share it around to your friends. And thank you very much. This has been Every Week English with Josh Golson. I will see you guys next time.